One morning, just as the courthouse stirred to life, there was a knock on her door. It wasn't her clerk. It wasn't another reporter. It was Detective Leonard Price, a veteran officer from the Baltimore PD, respected, measured, and not known for emotional displays. He closed the door behind him and spoke plainly. "They're not going to stop," he said. "This isn't just about Keller anymore. It's about the people who let him rise and the machine that protected him at every step. They're digging into your rulings, reaching out to old jurors, even pressuring retired officers to come forward with claims. It's coordinated." She didn't flinch, but something in her chest tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. His answer was simple. "Because I'm tired. Tired of pretending not to see what's broken. Tired of staying silent to keep a pension. I've spent years avoiding this fight. But now they're trying to erase someone who finally did the right thing." It was the first moment in weeks she felt something like relief, not from the chaos, but from knowing someone else could see it too. And he wasn't the only one. Later that night, Judge Grant made a call from a burner phone she bought in cash at a corner store 2 neighborhoods away. She couldn't trust official channels anymore. She asked for a meeting. The response came quickly. 1 hour. Highway Diner. Discreet. Detective Alicia Torres was waiting at a corner booth when Marlene walked in. Civilian clothes, no badge in sight. Her expression was hard to read, but her presence said everything. This was someone who understood the weight of stepping out of line in a system built to keep people in place. They spoke in hushed tones over untouched cups of coffee. Marlene slid a folder across the table, documents she had received anonymously, connecting Keller to a string of buried complaints and mishandled evidence. Alicia flipped through them slowly. Her face changed with every page, from curiosity to disbelief to anger. "I saw some of these years ago," she said. "They told me it was nothing. Just background noise. They made it disappear." "It wasn't nothing," Marlene said. "It was the beginning." Alicia looked up, meeting her eyes. "So what happens now?" "We bring it out," Marlene answered. "All of it." There was a long pause. Then Alicia nodded once. "I'm in." That simple phrase changed everything. With Alicia's help, they began cross-referencing records, reaching out to others who had stayed quiet for too long. Retired clerks. Investigative journalists. Even a former federal prosecutor named Daniel Ross, who handed over a thick envelope labeled incidental mentions. It was a start. Piece by piece, they rebuilt a paper trail that had been buried under years of bureaucracy and silence. The documents painted a pattern, Keller showing up on the edges of cases that went wrong, always nearby when evidence went missing, always clean on paper but never far from chaos. What they uncovered wasn't just misconduct. It was protection. It was design. And as the case against Keller grew, so did something else, a sense of quiet momentum. A shift. Whispers began turning into conversations. Fear began turning into frustration. And some of the people who once looked away now looked toward her, wondering what might be possible if someone finally stayed in the fight. Judge Grant didn't declare war. She didn't grandstand. She just kept showing up, kept collecting truth, kept connecting the dots. And slowly, the armor of the institution began to crack, not with noise, but with persistence. Not with rage, but with resolve. Because she was no longer the only one carrying the weight. Now, there were others. And they were ready to stand with her. By the time Judge Marlene Grant entered Courtroom 4C that morning, the atmosphere had transformed into something beyond tense. It was electric. Reporters had camped outside the courthouse hours before sunrise. Satellite trucks lined the curb like sentries. Protesters on both sides stood shoulder to shoulder, shouting into the cold, holding signs that either painted her as a savior or a disgrace. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a spectacle. A flashpoint. And the country was watching. Inside, every bench was filled. Officers sat stiffly in the back rows. Families of past victims huddled together near the front, wide-eyed and silent. Camera lenses tracked her every move, waiting for the moment where history might shift. But Judge Grant didn't rush. She stepped into the room with the same calm precision that had carried her through every challenge. But today, her presence felt different. Not performative, not angry, just anchored. As if her very existence in that space was a statement all its own. She tapped the gavel once and began. No pleasantries. No small talk. I am entering into the record a motion to admit newly uncovered evidence, she said, regarding systemic misconduct involving Deputy Marshal Ryan Keller and affiliated officers over a span of nearly 3 decades. A low murmur swept through the gallery. She continued. These documents reflect a coordinated pattern of cover-ups, deleted complaints, falsified records, and the quiet reassignment of witnesses, all centered around the same man and the system that protected him. Keller's attorney, Walton McCree, jumped to his feet before she even finished. Objection, Your Honor. This is outside the scope of today's hearing. Judge Grant's voice didn't rise. Counselor, you will sit down or you will be escorted out. The silence that followed wasn't just about control. It was about a shift in gravity. The courtroom now belonged to her. She opened a thick folder and began reading into the record. File after file. Internal reviews mysteriously closed. Officers with disciplinary records reassigned instead of reprimanded. Victims labeled unreliable. Witness statements lost. Every page told a story of institutional immunity. A machine designed not to protect justice, but to protect itself. Then she called her first witness, Detective Alicia Torres. Dressed in plain clothes, she walked forward and took the oath. The room shifted. Torres wasn't an outsider. She was one of them. A part of the same courthouse, the same culture. Her testimony carried weight. Judge Grant began the questioning. During your time as head of courthouse security, did you observe any inappropriate behavior by Deputy Keller?
Yes.
Multiple times. Did you report these incidents?
Yes.
And what happened to those reports? Most of them vanished. Disappeared from the system. Torres explained how Keller had intimidated witnesses, threatened staff, and once shoved a public defender against a wall. She spoke clearly, factually, without emotion. Just truth. She described how internal reports tied to Keller were deleted using credentials linked to his own account. The courtroom rippled with disbelief. McCree objected again and again. Each time, overruled. By noon, it was all over the news. Every major outlet ran with the same headlines. Federal judge drops bombshell. Alleged federal cover-up exposed. Justice Department monitoring developments. The White House declined to comment, but the silence said enough. They were watching now, too. And then came the final blow. Judge Grant held up one last document, a memo from 1993. It was faded, scanned, stamped with internal use only. She read it aloud, her voice steady. The report recommended full prosecution of a teenager named Marcus Grant. It described him as aggressive, combative, and beyond rehabilitation. It had been written by Officer R. Keller. She didn't editorialize. She didn't add drama. She just looked out across the courtroom and said, "You didn't just falsify a report. You built your career on a conviction that never should have happened." Keller didn't react. Not visibly. But something in his face shifted. The room watched as his composure slowly cracked, not with a shout, but with silence. For once, he wasn't in control. And everyone knew it. What began as a trial had now become an unveiling. Not just of one man, but of an entire system. Judge Grant stood at the center of the storm, unmoving. And around her, the courthouse, the country, had no choice but to look. The verdict came at 3:47 p.m. The jury had deliberated for hours, each minute stretching like a taut wire across the country's collective breath. When the foreman rose and read the words guilty on all counts, the sound didn't crash like thunder, it landed like truth. Sudden, undeniable, and heavy. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. A few gasps, a whispered finally, and the quiet rustle of tissues in shaking hands. No applause. No outbursts. Just the stillness that comes when justice, long overdue, finally steps into the room. Ryan Keller didn't move. He didn't cry or rage. He stood there blinking, stunned, like he had misread the script of a play he thought he controlled. The arrogance had drained from his face. In its place was disbelief. As if he still expected someone to step in and fix this, to undo what had just happened. But no one came. No one spoke up for him. Not this time. Judge Marlene Grant didn't offer a speech. She simply turned to the bailiff and gave the instruction. Remand the defendant into custody. The cuffs clicked, a sharp final note to a long, brutal symphony. As Keller was led out, the gallery watched, not with glee, but with a mixture of relief and reflection. It wasn't about watching him fall. It was about finally seeing the wall around him crack. Outside, the streets were alive. Reporters swarmed. Protesters chanted. Phones lit up with breaking news alerts. Civil rights groups issued statements. The Department of Justice announced a formal review into federal law enforcement misconduct. Former prosecutors came forward. Whistleblowers, once silent, began to speak. In less than a week, resignations followed. Entire divisions were reorganized. What had begun as a trial became something larger. A shift. A crack in the armor. But inside her chambers, Marlene Grant didn't feel triumphant. She felt the weight. Because even as the headlines called her brave, even as people on the courthouse steps held signs that read "Thank you, Judge Grant," the real impact didn't come through praise. It came through threats. Anonymous calls late at night. Notes taped to her car windshield. Her home address leaked online. A black SUV parked across from her house for hours, engine off, just watching. No one said it outright, but the message was clear: you've gone too far. You broke the rules, not the legal ones, but the unspoken ones. The ones that said power protects power. She hired private security. Changed her routines. Refused interviews. Turned down offers for book deals, podcasts, primetime exclusives. She didn't want to be a celebrity. She just wanted to keep doing her job. And somehow, she did. Day after day, she showed up. Hair pulled back, robe pressed, eyes forward. Her rulings were still fair. Still measured. But something in the room had changed. Officers who used to roll their eyes now stood a little straighter. Public defenders thanked her more quietly. Victims who once felt invisible watched her with cautious hope. She had become a symbol, not because she wanted to be, but because someone had to be. Across the country, conversations began to shift. City councils held emergency sessions to audit use of force policies. Schools requested officer background records. Small towns debated their own courtroom transparency. It wasn't a revolution, not yet. But it was something. And it was growing. And the backlash grew with it. She was called biased. Dangerous. A disgrace to the robe. Legal associations quietly debated whether she had overstepped. Petitions were circulated. Investigations launched. Every move she made became a headline. But none of it shook her. Because in her pocket, she carried a folded note. No name. No signature. Just 3 lines, handwritten on notebook paper. You saw us. You believed us. Thank you. That's what this was about. Not vengeance. Not optics. But visibility. Because for every Keller, there were 10 others who never faced a courtroom. And for every verdict, there were 100 families who never got their day. If she could make even one of them feel seen, it was worth it. Judge Marlene Grant didn't want a statue. She didn't want a legacy. She wanted a system that didn't bury truth. And if it meant being the woman who refused to look away, then so be it. Because justice isn't loud. It isn't clean. It isn't always safe. But sometimes, all it takes is one person standing in the fire and refusing to move. And from there, the rest begin to follow. This story reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it looks like showing up every day even when the world wants you silent. Judge Marlene Grant didn't set out to become a symbol. She simply refused to ignore injustice when it stood right in front of her. And in doing so, she showed us that one person, standing firm in truth, can shake an entire system. For older audiences who've lived through decades of promises and disappointment, this story is a powerful reminder that change is slow, but it starts when someone dares to hold the line. It teaches us that even when you're tired, even when you're scared, your voice still matters. Whether in a courtroom, a classroom, or a quiet conversation, standing for what's right doesn't require perfection, just the decision not to look away. Integrity doesn't retire. It deepens with time, and wisdom becomes a shield when courage meets experience. If you've ever felt like your story no longer counts, remember Judge Grant. Her age didn't make her irrelevant. It made her unshakable. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. What lessons stood out most to you? And what kind of stories would you like to see next? Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story that inspires, empowers, and speaks to what really matters. A federal marshal slapped a judge in open court, but what happened next shattered the silence of an entire nation. This isn't just a trial, it's a reckoning. Stay with us until the end, because the truth she exposes could change everything. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story that dares to go deeper. It was supposed to be just another routine court hearing. A cold winter morning in Baltimore, the kind where the chill sinks into your bones and lingers for days. The courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm, clerks shuffling papers, security scanning bags, and attorneys whispering last-minute strategies. But in Courtroom 4C, something was different. The air didn't just hum with routine. It pulsed with tension, like the walls themselves knew something was about to crack. Judge Marlene Grant stood in front of the tall mirror in her chambers, adjusting the sleeves of her black robe with practiced ease. At 63, she had walked into more courtrooms than she could count. Her silver curls framed a face etched with decades of experience. Calm, unreadable, but carrying a fire behind her eyes that only those who really knew her could see. This morning, she felt it. Not nerves, but an alertness, like her spirit was standing just a bit taller. She wasn't just preparing for a trial. She was preparing for a confrontation. One that she didn't see coming, but somehow had been waiting for her all along. Downstairs, Courtroom 4C was packed. The wooden benches were filled shoulder to shoulder. Reporters scribbled in notepads. A few families of past victims clutched tissues and each other's hands. Even a handful of police officers sat in the back, some by assignment, others by curiosity. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. No one spoke above a whisper. Every eye was trained on the empty bench at the front, waiting for Judge Grant to appear. Then the doors opened and she entered, her heels clicking like a gavel on polished wood. Her presence was commanding, but not showy. She didn't need theatrics. Her power came from stillness, from the way she carried years of battles and victories and heartbreak in every step. She took her seat, looked around the room, and without saying a word, told everyone she was ready. A few moments later, Deputy U.S. Marshal Ryan Keller walked in. Broad-shouldered, chin high. His crisp uniform practically gleamed under the courtroom lights. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't even glance at the bench. Instead, he nodded toward a group of uniformed officers sitting on the left, a signal only they understood. He took the witness stand like it belonged to him, settling in with the same smirk that had gotten him out of more trouble than he ever deserved. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly. Focused. Her voice, when it came, was even and firm. The questioning began. Time, place, what happened. At first, it felt procedural. But quickly, her tone shifted. With each question, she carved deeper into the details, pushing beyond the polished report he'd filed. His answers grew shorter. His gaze flickered. He bounced his leg beneath the table, gripped the armrest just a little too tight. The smirk? It didn't last. This wasn't just a hearing. Not anymore. It was the beginning of something larger, something heavier. The courtroom felt it, even if they couldn't name it yet. It was in the way Judge Grant's words hit with precision. In the way Keller avoided eye contact. In the silence that grew thicker with each question. This wasn't just about one case. It was about power, and what happens when someone finally dares to confront it. The tension in Courtroom 4C didn't let up, it only deepened. Judge Marlene Grant's questions grew sharper, more specific. What had started as a standard line of inquiry had now become something else entirely. The gallery felt it. Reporters stopped writing. The quiet whispers that usually filled the background vanished. Everyone was listening, waiting to see where she would go next. Deputy Marshal Ryan Keller, once so composed, now showed small cracks in his armor. His jaw tensed. His eyes darted toward the back of the courtroom where a few officers sat, watching him closely. Judge Grant's tone remained calm but unyielding. She revisited the timeline of events, the use of force, the justification for Keller's actions. Then she paused and asked a question that made the entire room lean in. Was he aware that the subject involved in the incident was just 14 years old? Keller didn't deny it. He answered without hesitation, almost with a shrug, downplaying it. Size doesn't equal innocence, he said, like the boy's age didn't matter. A quiet murmur rippled through the back rows. Someone whispered something angry under their breath. Judge Grant held up a hand. Silence returned. She continued. Was the subject armed? Keller paused for just a moment, but it was long enough. No, he admitted. And yet, she continued, you deployed your taser, tackled him, and used force that resulted in a hospital stay. Keller's response was simple. He feared for his safety. Even with the boy kneeling, hands up, not moving. There was no reaction in Judge Grant's expression, but the room felt her shift. Without raising her voice, she gestured to the court clerk. Play the video. The lights dimmed slightly as the footage appeared on the screen behind her. The image wasn't crystal clear, but it didn't need to be. The truth was visible. A young black boy, clearly no older than 14, knelt in a parking lot. His hands were raised high, palms open. He didn't move. Not once. Seconds passed in silence. Then, without warning, Keller charged at him like a linebacker. The boy crumpled to the ground, the sound of the impact echoing louder than the video itself. The courtroom gasped. One juror covered their mouth. Another leaned forward in disbelief. No one looked away. Judge Grant's voice returned, measured but firm. Would the deputy like to revise his earlier statement? Keller didn't respond. His eyes locked with hers, his face unreadable but brimming with something colder, contempt. He muttered something under his breath. Quiet, but not quiet enough. You people always think you're in control. The words landed like a slap. The gallery froze. No one moved. Grant didn't blink. She asked him to repeat it. Keller looked her in the eye and did. People like you. The meaning wasn't lost on anyone. His tone, the way he leaned forward, the bitter edge in his voice, it wasn't just disrespect. It was deep-rooted hate disguised in formality. Judge Grant remained steady, but the room was already shifting. Officers in the back sat straighter. Court Security Chief Alicia Torres stepped forward slightly, ready to intervene. Grant didn't raise her voice. She simply instructed Keller to sit. When he didn't move, she warned him. He finally sat down, but not out of obedience, out of strategy. Like it was his idea. Like he was still in control. But he wasn't. Not anymore. Because this wasn't a courtroom operating under fear. Not while Judge Marlene Grant was presiding. She saw through the smirk, through the posturing, through the years of unchecked arrogance dressed in uniform. And while Keller might have thought he was just getting through another hearing, Grant knew better. She had heard voices like his before. She had seen the damage they caused. But what he didn't know was that this time, the law was staring back, and it was done being silent. What unfolded in those early moments wasn't just legal procedure, it was the start of a reckoning. The gallery felt it. The press felt it. Even the officers in the room felt it. For the first time, Ryan Keller was being held accountable. Not just for what he did, but for what he represented. And Judge Grant wasn't just asking questions. She was laying a foundation. Because the truth wasn't just emerging. It was rising, and it had finally found its voice. The air inside courtroom 4C had shifted. What started as tension had now hardened into something heavier. Something sharp and volatile, like the room itself was holding its breath. Judge Marlene Grant kept her expression calm, but everyone could see the fire behind her eyes. She wasn't just dissecting a case anymore. She was peeling back layers of a lie that had been protected for far too long. And sitting at the center of it was Deputy Marshal Ryan Keller, whose mask of arrogance was starting to crack. The court reconvened after a short recess, but nothing about the mood was casual. Reporters returned to their seats quickly. Some didn't even sit, they stood at the back, phones ready, waiting for anything that might ignite. And it didn't take long. Keller was already at the defense table, this time with his lawyer Walton McCree by his side. The smirk was gone. His body was more rigid, less relaxed. He scanned the room carefully now, his confidence replaced by something colder, calculation. McCree rose to address the court. He tried to coat his words in civility, offering a clarification on behalf of his client. Ryan Keller, he said, regretted the tone of his remarks from earlier. But then came the twist. He claimed the comments were taken out of context, misinterpreted, even misunderstood. Judge Grant let him finish without interruption. Then she turned to Keller directly. Did he want to retract his statement? He looked right at her and said no. Not even a pause. No apology, no hesitation, just a wall of defiance. A hush fell over the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Everyone understood what had just happened. This wasn't damage control. It was a line in the sand. Judge Grant nodded and proceeded, refusing to flinch. What followed was an hour of intense cross-examination and the slow unearthing of Keller's disciplinary history. Dozens of internal complaints, most dismissed or buried. Each page she read felt like a hammer striking the courtroom floor. But Keller didn't flinch. He stared ahead, fists clenched, jaw tight. When she revealed that new evidence had been obtained in a separate civil rights suit implicating him in the destruction of key files, McCree leapt to his feet, shouting objections. But Grant had already scheduled an emergency evidentiary hearing for that afternoon. She was a step ahead, and the defense knew it. The room was reeling, but what came next wasn't in anyone's script. As the court stood for recess, Keller moved. He stepped forward, too fast, too close. His eyes locked on Judge Grant. And before anyone could react, his hand struck her across the face. It happened so fast most people didn't register it until they heard the sound. A sharp, echoing crack that silenced the room. Gasps filled the air. Someone dropped a phone. A reporter shouted. The bailiffs froze for a second too long. Judge Grant's head snapped slightly from the force, but she didn't stumble. She didn't even touch the red blooming on her lip. She stood tall, her expression calm, unervingly calm. Ryan Keller didn't try to run. He stood there, breathing heavy, like he was waiting for someone to dare stop him. And that's when Judge Grant spoke. Her voice was cool, measured, terrifying in its control. She ordered him into custody. The room held still. The bailiffs hesitated. Not out of confusion, but fear. Not of the judge. Of Keller. Of what he represented. Of what might happen next. But she didn't break. She repeated the order. And finally, one of the bailiffs moved, reaching for the cuffs. Keller snapped at him, his voice rising, filled with venom. He warned them not to touch him. Promised regret. Threats spilled out like poison. But the cuffs clicked shut anyway. The sound of them echoed like a verdict. As Keller was led away, he passed Judge Grant and leaned in just enough for a final threat. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you won? You think they'll let this stand?" She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence said more than any words could. She simply turned away, returning to her chambers, the weight of the moment pressing into her bones. She wasn't afraid. But she knew this was only the beginning. Because the real storm, the one behind the uniform, the power, the silence, was just getting started. The courtroom had emptied, but Judge Marlene Grant remained. She stood at the edge of her chambers, staring out the window as the winter wind howled outside. Her lips still ached from the slap, but that wasn't what lingered. What lingered was the look in Ryan Keller's eyes, the venom in his voice, and the silence of a system that had hesitated to protect one of its own. She had faced pressure before. Threats. Scrutiny. But something about this moment was different. This wasn't just about a dangerous man abusing power. This was deeper. More personal. And she didn't know why, until she saw the envelope. It had been slid under her door while she was in court. Plain manila. No markings. Just her name typed neatly in bold black letters. She hadn't opened it at first. She'd been too angry, too focused. But now, in the quiet, something told her to look. She took it to her desk and opened it slowly, almost cautiously, like her instincts already knew what was inside. The contents were a storm in paper form. Dozens of documents, scanned files, redacted reports, photos, internal memos. Many of them labeled internal use only. Some had names she recognized from previous cases. Others were completely foreign. But one thing became clear quickly. This was a trail of misconduct tied to Ryan Keller. And it wasn't new. It went back decades. Complaints, investigations, suspicious case closures, evidence tampering, excessive force, all tied to his name, and somehow all swept away like dust under a rug. But the last page was what stopped her cold. There, in faded ink, was a name she hadn't seen in years. Marcus Grant. Her brother. Her breath caught. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page. A report, filed over 30 years ago, naming a then-rookie officer R. Keller as part of the arrest team. The charges had included theft, obstruction, and resisting arrest. Marlene had been just 13 at the time. She remembered that night vividly. Marcus handcuffed in their front yard, face down in the snow, shouting that he didn't do it. She remembered her mother crying in the kitchen, the public defender whispering that they should take the plea deal, that fighting back would only make it worse. She remembered the sound of the prison doors slamming behind her brother and how nothing in their family had ever felt whole again after that. She'd always believed him. Marcus had said the cops planted the evidence, that they had it out for him, that they wanted to make an example. She wanted to believe him. But back then, belief wasn't enough. Back then, they didn't have power. They had fear. They had silence. They had shame. And now, 3 decades later, that same cop had stood in her courtroom, had lied under oath, had raised his hand against her. And now she knew, he hadn't just walked into her courtroom by chance. He had already been in her life long before either of them realized it. Long before she wore the robe. Long before she knew how much one man's lie could reshape a family. Marlene sank into her chair, the documents spread out before her like fragments of an old nightmare. She wasn't the judge now. She was the girl who stood in the doorway as her brother was taken away. The girl who had no voice, no power, no chance. But that girl had grown. And now, she wasn't powerless. Now, she was the system Keller had once manipulated. And she had no intention of letting this pass unnoticed. She gathered the documents, placed them back in the envelope, and walked to her personal safe. She locked them inside, then leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing deeply, steadying herself. This wasn't just about professional duty anymore. This was personal. And Ryan Keller had no idea who he had struck, not just in the courtroom, but in history. She straightened her spine, pulled on her coat, and stepped into the cold hallway. The courthouse was nearly empty, but her footsteps echoed with purpose. She wasn't just preparing for another day in court. She was preparing for a war she hadn't expected, but was more than ready to fight. The next morning came without peace. Judge Marlene Grant arrived at the courthouse before the sun had fully risen, hoping for a moment of quiet, a breath to gather her thoughts before the storm resumed. But calm had long since left the building. From the moment she stepped through the doors, she could feel the difference. The courthouse no longer buzzed with routine. It vibrated with controlled tension. Officers who used to nod politely avoided her eyes. Clerks looked down as she passed. The silence wasn't respectful. It was cold. When she opened her inbox, it was already overflowing. Dozens of messages marked urgent. The first was from the Office of Judicial Conduct. A formal notice. Her courtroom behavior was under preliminary review. The language was clipped and impersonal. 2 sentences, no greeting. The second message was worse. It came from the Police Benevolent Union, demanding her immediate suspension pending a full inquiry into what they called a pattern of bias against law enforcement. The third wasn't digital. It was a plain white envelope, no return address, slid under her office door sometime during the night. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 7 words printed in block font. "Step down or we'll come for everything." She stared at the note for a long moment, then calmly struck a match, dropped it into her sink, and watched it burn. The message was clear. The system wasn't just defending itself now, it was attacking her. She was no longer just a judge. She had become a threat. Outside, the media frenzy had exploded. Screens lit up with her name. Cable networks ran endless loops of the courtroom video, some showing the slap, others focusing on her ordering Keller's arrest. The narratives spun fast. One headline called her a hero. Another said she had politicized the bench. One network framed her as a symbol of accountability. Another suggested she had lost control. The mayor's office released a vague statement about needing calm and civility. The governor's team said they were monitoring the situation. No one defended her by name, but everyone knew who they were talking about. Political pressure was rising like floodwater. Then came the visit. District Attorney Robert Langston walked into her chambers without asking to sit. He was polished, calm, and visibly uncomfortable. A politician first, a prosecutor second. He told her that national attention was escalating and donors were pressuring the mayor to demand her resignation. There were already whispers of an ethics investigation. The unions were mobilizing, painting her as a judge with a personal vendetta. And behind all of it, there was one consistent demand: recusal. He handed her a draft statement, just a few paragraphs. She would announce that the courtroom had become too charged and, in the interest of preserving the integrity of the process, she would step away. No admission of wrongdoing, no consequences, just a clean exit. If she signed, he said, they'd back off. No hearings. No public battles. Her reputation would stay intact. She didn't respond. She just looked at the paper, then at him. Langston tried again, softer this time. He wasn't saying she did the wrong thing, just that the system didn't know how to handle it. The courtroom wasn't built for moments like this, he said. It was built to protect itself. She finally spoke. She asked him if he realized what he was saying. That she should protect the very system that had silenced victims and enabled Keller for years. Langston didn't answer. He just looked tired. Worn down by a system that rewarded silence. She took the paper from his hand, folded it slowly, then tore it in half. He stared at her. "Marlene," he said, "are you really ready to go to war with all of them?" "No," she replied. "But I'm not afraid of it either." When he left, she stood alone again in the stillness of her office. Her lip had healed, but the scar left behind wasn't physical. The courthouse no longer felt like a place of safety. It felt like a battlefield. Every word she said would be watched. Every ruling, dissected. But even now, with the system turning against her, she didn't flinch. Because the people attacking her had power. But she had something stronger, the truth. And no matter how loud the threats became, she wasn't going to sit down. The attacks kept coming. Each day brought a new wave of headlines, accusations, and veiled threats. Judge Marlene Grant knew the cost of standing her ground, but she hadn't expected just how far the system would go to break her. Legal analysts on morning shows questioned her impartiality. Social media swarmed with doctored videos, twisted quotes, and conspiracy theories. Former colleagues stopped calling. And behind the scenes, complaints from past cases were being dusted off and quietly refiled, painting her as a rogue judge with an anti-police agenda. She was being surrounded. But what the system didn't anticipate was that she wasn't standing there alone.